Welcome back to Finweek Money Matters. Now, according to the latest Ernst Young Entrepreneurship Barometer report, stringent labour legislation is creating an incredibly high barrier to entry for South African entrepreneurs. The Barometer, which ranks every G20 country in terms of access to funding, entrepreneurship culture, tax and regulation, amongst other things, ranked South Africa 143rd out of 144 countries on firing and hiring practices. We talked to Cheryl Jane Kujenga, who is a strategic growth markets leader at Ernst Young, and Christo, executive director at Business Partners Limited, about the institutional barriers that entrepreneurs face locally. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Now, to a large extent, one hears South Africans patting themselves on the back when we look at World Bank rankings in terms of the ease of doing business. But it seems that once businesses have surpassed the startup phase, that there are other challenges that entrepreneurs are facing. Maybe let's start with you, Cheryl. Can you just give us a broad landscape picture of what are the key fundamental structural challenges that entrepreneurs are having to take on?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's important to state up front that South Africa is such a land of contrasts. So you rightly say, on the one hand, we rank quite highly in terms of ease of doing business. We are seen as the gateway to Africa. But when you start to dig deep into the institutional barriers which hamper a growing company, issues of regulation and strict regulation that on the one hand are a positive become quite a negative for an organization that's growing. The labor issues you mentioned are significant. You find that a lot of companies that are at that apex of about, just as they're about to grow, would rather remain informal because the labor practices are so stringent. We found that in terms of certainly in terms of our study. The other issue that starts to impact entrepreneurs in South Africa is the one of education and making sure that we've got a skilled labor force. So we've got a growing middle class, but we don't necessarily have the right skills in place to enable the right rate of growth of business.
Maybe let me throw to you, Chris. I mean, to a large extent, we hear, especially around the National Development Plan and the President speaking time and time again, that it's on the back of small and medium-sized businesses that South Africa is going to create X number of jobs by 2020. Now, if these companies are actually having difficulty when it comes to that phase where they're about to expand, is the legislation in place adequate enough to support? And it seems from where I'm sitting that it isn't adequate, but what should we be doing about it?
Yeah, it's actually, the labor legislation is very good from a labor point of view, but it is not conducive to business. And it's actually making it very stringent to actually do business, especially small businesses, because they must fall into line with the bargaining council and labor unions as rates that's being put forward, and then they need to hire these people, pay them at those high rates, and it's starting to become much more cheaper to rather invest in equipment and replace the labor and put them in, and also then the shortage of skills, as we've already heard, that is an issue. So small businesses do find it very difficult, and also then all the returns and so on that you need to complete to have one employee or 2 or 3 or 10, and then the skills gap. The corporate world is grabbing all those skills before the small businesses,
So how can small businesses possibly get around it, besides remaining informal? I mean, what can they do? Is there another body they can go to? Are there different strategies they can employ to get around these laws, or are they just sort of set in concrete and that's what they have to deal with?
Well,
go ahead, Cheryl.
If you look at our report, we've actually called it the power of 3, because we believe that it's a collaboration between government, corporate and entrepreneurs. You can't look at one without the other. If I take the labor issue, we're oversimplifying it to a degree, because in reality, South Africa has got such a deep-seated social inequality that it breeds the sorts of issues that we're seeing. So you've got to deal with the issue of social inequality. You've got to deal with the issue of labor, and then you've also got to deal with the issue of education. And the three of those will start to provide a platform.
Because surely those labor laws are there for a reason. It's because of our
exactly.
history, so you have to balance
Exactly.
the two.
Exactly.
I guess another interesting aspect of this conversation that has come in the spotlight recently with the whole NEF funding of a certain store in a certain suburb in Johannesburg is the funding question. Now, to a large extent, one always hears about the DTI and the various initiatives that are in place for entrepreneurs to actually access funding. Are you saying that this is not a reflection of what is actually happening on the ground? And let me start with you, Christo.
Yeah, you see, what's happening, the money is available. It's available to viable businesses, and the financiers are also there to make a return, So I think there's deeper issues. It's easily said, yeah, it's the money, it's the problem, but there's other structural issues that is the problem.
I would agree with that. I've spoken with a lot of VCs and seed engines over the past couple of months, and the money is there, the goodwill is there, but where a lot of entrepreneurs fall down as well is that they don't have a marketable product. So they have great ideas, they're just not translating that into something that the market actually needs.
Right.
It's not scalable. So they're lacking that business acumen, and then when it comes to legislation and taxes, then it's just very difficult for them to handle those sort of front office issues.
I see you nodding, Christian.
Should entrepreneurs then have something before you get to the funding part of it? Something where someone can help you as an entrepreneur who doesn't have the skills to deal with all these things we looked at, entrepreneurship culture, tax and regulation, education, training, that sort of thing. Shouldn't there be a sort of an industry body that helps entrepreneurs from that step before you get the funding? Is there something like that available?
So this question comes up quite a lot. Should we have a separate ministry for entrepreneurship? Should we have a separate body? I believe that it goes beyond that, because that just adds another barrier. That's another element of bureaucracy. If we look at big business has a role to play. It's important that big business starts to look at their supply chain and look at even potential competitors that are still small and see how they can support them. If we look at our codes, BEE codes, and we look at the issue of enterprise development, if you start to make it a hearts and minds issue, and you start to collaborate and not just look at it from a color perspective and in terms of ticking a box, then you actually start to collaborate and build a better working world.
Let me throw a curveball at you, Cheryl, because to a large extent, when one does get into this conversation about enterprise development through supply chain, and you strip it a little bit, you tend to find that the small and medium-sized players in that space are really relegated to support services. We see the small cleaning companies, the catering companies. Now, maybe you can give us some insight about the scope or the opportunity for those small businesses to actually get involved in mainstream business activity. Are we there yet as South African entrepreneurs? And let me start with you, Christo, and throw to Cheryl afterwards.
Yeah, I feel we are there. There's lots of fairly good small and medium businesses. That's not just for the cleaning and for the security of the, let's say, the mines or the manufacturing concerns. They are actually in the supply chain, and they are a tier 1 or a tier 2 or a tier 3 type of supplier in the vehicle industry, where the vehicle manufacturing and even vehicle services, there it's happening. In the mining industry it's happening. You get small businesses that's in hydraulics, in the engineering side, and so on. Very good, solid businesses, also empowered businesses. So it is there, but I think just the barrier to entry is just too high. And I just hope that we would see the light and actually ease on labor laws.
Cheryl, do you think that if we look at incentives as another element of getting entrepreneurs to take up the appetite to start up their own businesses, is the government doing enough to entice young South Africans and even older South Africans that have business ideas to consider sort of breaking out of the of corporate South Africa and going it alone?
I think the government is doing a lot, to be fair to the government. Where I find the challenge, and I don't know if everyone would agree with me, is I think our entrepreneurs are thinking too small. We don't have enough people thinking big. So we've got a lot of really great small businesses. I would challenge the fact that we have enough of those small businesses that are looking and saying they will become the next Discoveries, they will become the next Bidvests. And that, I think, is where our challenge lies, in pulling that pull-push factor between getting those small businesses to become the future market leaders that we need them to be.
And what are your thoughts on having a Ministry of Enterprise Development and that kind of thing, having a whole department just focused entirely on SMEs? What are your thoughts on that?
As we've heard, it can just be another barrier to get over. So, government they can only create the environment. It is entrepreneurs that want to be out there, want to do it,
that
want to make a
happen.
difference.
Yeah.
And that is part of our education system and what is embedded into the culture. Do you want to be something? And do you want to get it for free, or do you want to work for it and be an entrepreneur and sweat it out?
So do you believe we're lacking a culture of entrepreneurship here, and a sort of
an appetite, if you will.
For taking risks and for failing, because we've often been criticized for being a nation that's too scared to fail and for being very risk averse. Whereas in America they have things like FailCon, which is a conference where people just go there and talk about how they failed and it's glamorized. Whereas here it's seen as very, very bad, and you can't get up after that and you're blacklisted.
I would hate to say that we don't have a culture of entrepreneurship. I've met some really, really great businesses over the years. We've got to, and I agree with you, we've got to celebrate the failures. We've got to talk about the entrepreneurial journeys a lot more. Because I think our youth particularly start to think that it's easy. They forget that it is a journey. A lot of our really successful entrepreneurs failed more than once. So we've got to do.
And I don't think those stories are told enough.
Not enough.
Can I see you nodding, Christo? Yeah. Can I just ask one question? Is there something that entrepreneurs can do? We're talking about all these barriers to entry and how tough it is with labor and education, etc. What can entrepreneurs do to help make this barrier sort of less hectic so that other people can also get into the market?
Well, they must lobby and join even organized business groups, through the formal business structures that's there, and actually use the bodies affiliated to BUSA and so on, and knock on the doors of government, knock on the doors of labor, and actually tell them about their real problems that they have. But also, those that successful must speak out about their success and how they overcame the obstacles, because there's definitely very good stories, of how they overcame the obstacles.
Of course, and on that note of optimism, and Cheryl, you speak about having come across a range of businesses over the years throughout your work. Is there one small business or entrepreneur that stands out for you as a really fantastic South African story that has managed to not only circumvent the very barriers that we're speaking about now, but really stands as a case study with lessons that can be extrapolated?
I can think of more than one, but do you want me to share it?
Just one, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And I think it's one that's work in progress. And I mention these guys all the time because I wish I was like them at that age. They're a group of young entrepreneurs called Pellegrin. They've started an energy company. We first met them through our own enterprise development initiatives, and they've recently really started to corporatize and grow. And I wish I was telling you the story 10, 15 years from now, because I have no doubt that they're going to be a success story. But when I look at them, when I look at the intelligence, and I look at that group of people and the drive that they have, I would certainly say that there's a lot to be optimistic about.
And so perhaps what it sounds like to me is that we also need to be creating platforms where these stories can be shared, and that these entrepreneurs that have managed to circumvent some of these barriers can actually share on how they've managed to do that.
I would agree. I think there are lots of good stories out there, and probably as members of the media we're a bit guilty in that we only listen to the companies who have the fancy press releases going out. But there are a couple of initiatives that are really doing amazing things. I just thought of their Way To project. It's another great one. It's doing amazing things. So these stories do need to be told. So those entrepreneurs that are out there, you know, shout loud and tell us what you're doing, because it's inspiring and others need to see it being done as well.